All right, good evening and welcome back. We have not had Sunday evening Bible study in a long time. We've had a lot of church meetings going on and praise in the gym. It wasn't in the park. We've just had a lot going on. So there's some controversy brewing as to where we are tonight. But Ed always writes it down when we're done, and we had several that agree with him. We're in 2 Kings 23:31. Some missed a night and think we're further behind, but we're going to go with 23:31, and we're done with the northern kingdom. They collapsed back in chapter 17 or so they're out of the picture. Everything for the rest of this book is the southern kingdom of Judah. We've just had Josiah, or in chapter 23, we had Josiah the great reformer, re-emphasized the book of the law, started all of these reforms, started putting some of these practices back in. And but Josiah he died at a young age. Of course, he was like a kid when he became king, but he died at a relatively young age. I don't think he was 40. So we've had all sorts of religious reforms take place, but there's political instability. And religious stability and political stability have nothing to do with each other, okay? That's my political statement for tonight, all right? They're two different things. Chapter 23, verse 31. Jehoaz was 23 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. His mother's name was Hamutal, daughter of Jeremiah. She was from Libnah. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as his fathers had done. Pharaoh Necho put him in chains at Riblah in the land of Hamath, so that he might not reign in Jerusalem. And he imposed on Judah a levy of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. So you got 100 talents of silver. How come only 1 talent of gold? Because silver was worth more than gold in those days, okay? Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, son of Josiah, king in place of his father Josiah, and changed Eliakim's name to Jehoiakim. But he took Jehoaz and carried him off to Egypt, and there he died. Jehoiakim paid Pharaoh Necho the silver and gold he demanded. In order to do so, he taxed the land and exacted the silver and gold from the people of the land according to their assessments. So Pharaoh wasted little time after the death of Josiah. And basically what he does is he sets Judah up as a vassal state of Egypt. Verse 36. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. His mother's name was Zebedah, daughter of Pedaiah. She was from Rumah. And he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as his fathers had done. So the nation had declined as a power. There were many Jews who remained loyal, though, to the reforms of Josiah. Chapter 24. During Jehoiakim's reign, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded the land, and Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years. But then he changed his mind and rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. The Lord sent Babylonian, and it might say Chaldean, it might say Aramean, or it might say Chaldean, Aramean, Moabite, Ammonite raiders against him. He sent them to destroy Judah in accordance with the word of the Lord proclaimed by his servants and prophets. Surely these things happened to Judah according to the Lord's command, in order to remove them from his presence because of the sins of Manasseh and all he had done, including the shedding of innocent blood, for he had filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord was not willing to forgive. As for all the other events of Jehoiakim's reign and all he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the king of Judah? Jehoiakim rested with his fathers, and Jehoiachin, his son, succeeded him as king. The king of Egypt did not march out from his own country again, because the king of Babylon had taken all his territory from the Wadi of Egypt to the Euphrates River. So we see, as you look at, if you would see sort of a map in motion back in those days of the political powers, Egypt once had been a power, and then a lot of power went to the Assyrians, Then the Assyrians kind of went by the wayside, and Egypt grew again. And then Babylon was, the Babylonian Empire was growing, and Egypt was shrinking. So these events that we just finished there in verse 7, and somewhere around 600 BC, give or take a few years, Judah is essentially no longer a nation able to stand on their own. They aren't destroyed yet in the same manner as Israel to the north, but they are no longer self-governing, really. They're a vassal to a stronger nation. Many would be deported. And what made it worse, it seems that various stronger nations are now fighting for control of the land. If you look at a map of Israel, historically, the land is sort of this land bridge between Africa and Asia. So it's a very important travel route. It's a nice piece of land to have if you're in that business. Verse 8, Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. Now, what does that tell you? It's a lot of political instability. His mother's name was Nehushta, daughter of Elnathan. She was from Jerusalem. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father had done. At that time, the officers of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, advanced on Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And Nebuchadnezzar himself came up to the city while his officers were besieging it. Jehoiachin, king of Judah, his mother, his attendants, his nobles, and his officials all surrendered to him. Now, we know that this was in 597 BC. We know that from historical accounts. By the way, Jeremiah chapter 52 tells the same story. In the 8th year of the reign of the king of Babylon, he took Jehoiachin prisoner. As the Lord had declared, Nebuchadnezzar removed all the treasures from the temple of the Lord and from the royal palace, and took away all the gold articles that Solomon, king of Israel, had made for the temple of the Lord. He carried into exile all Jerusalem, all the officers and fighting men, and all the craftsmen and artisans, a total of 10,000. Only the poorest people of the land were left. So we're really getting the Reader's Digest version, okay? Most historians believe that this larger deportation took place about 11 years after this. There were several deportations of the people. Anyway, Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiachin captive to Babylon. He also took from Jerusalem to Babylon the king's mother, his wives, his officials, and the leading men of the land. The king of Babylon also deported to Babylon the entire force of 7,000 fighting men, strong and fit for war, and 1,000 craftsmen and artisans. He made Mattaniah, Jehoiachin's uncle, king in his place, and changed his name to Zedekiah. All right, so the king of Babylon has now set up his own king. Mattaniah, also called Zedekiah, was the brother of Jehoaz, who had been the king that was carried off into Egypt and died there. The Babylonian king probably chose him because he thought he would be anti-Egypt, because Egypt took his brother away and had him killed. The Babylonians and the Egyptians wanted control of the land, and a lot of things haven't changed. Verse 18. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. That's the reason I was talking about 11 years later, this other deportation took place. His mother's name was Hamutal, daughter of Jeremiah. She was from Libnah. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as Jehoiakim had done. It was because of the Lord's anger that all of this happened to Jerusalem and Judah, and in the end he thrust them from his presence. Now Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. So I've asked the question before. Have you come up with an answer? God destroyed them, right? Who destroyed them? Who allowed them to be destroyed? Well, let's just read this again. Verse 20, okay? It was because of the Lord's anger that all of this happened to Jerusalem and Judah. Does that give you a little hint? Who allowed this to happen? God. Yes. God. I want you to think about that. Because who is the true Israel? According to the Apostle Paul. And according to the Apostle John. We are. Okay, who are the children of Abraham? That doesn't mean that we forget about the Jews. In fact, we ought to be evangelizing the Jews. And there are a lot of Christians that are doing that, and we need to be doing that, okay? But when we think of Israel, and I'm not talking about the nation that exists now, I'm not anti anything, okay? That's not where I'm coming at. But spiritually, we now are descendants of Abraham, okay? And just as ancient Israel was supposed to share the name of the Lord, now we are supposed to, in some parts of the world, we're doing about as good a job as the ancient Israelites did. And we saw what happened to them, right? So just food for thought. I'm not saying don't think this, don't think that, but just think about these things. Zedekiah became influenced by the pro-Egyptian party. And anyway, that once great nation, they're basically dissolved now. And when I talk about the deportations, there were several of them, waves of deportations, and just like what happened in the northern kingdom, it was basically the educated. We saw where the fighting men, the fit fighting men left. It was the educated, the people that were accountants, the people that were lawyers, the people that were these tradesmen. They were taken. The regular farmer and the elderly and what they were just left behind to fend for themselves, by the way, and often that meant they starved to death. Chapter 25, verse 1. So in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. He encamped outside the city and built siege works all around it. The city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. So basically, this fairly good-sized city for that time has walls around it, and everybody's in there, and there's an army outside. So that means very, very little goods are coming in. What they could plant in the walled city, they would. But 2 years now, people are starving, okay? And they probably have starved to death, some have. It's not a pretty picture, okay? Because we read this, it's so sanitized. We do. The city was kept under siege until the 11th year. Oh, no, we're talking 2 years of people starving to death. Not pretty. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city became so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. Then the city wall was broken through and the whole army fled at night. You see what was happening? The last defenders are getting out of there. The city wall was broken through. The whole army fled at night through the gate between the two walls near the king's garden through the Babylonians or Chaldeans, though they were surrounding the city. They fled toward the Arabah, which is the Jordan Valley, but the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his soldiers were separated from him and scattered, and he was captured. He was taken to the king of Babylon at Riblah, where the sentence was pronounced on him. They killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Then they put out his eyes, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. All right, so following this, they're going to be completely destroyed. On the 7th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, an official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army, under the commander of the imperial guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had gone over to the king of Babylon. But the commander left behind some of the poorest people of the land to work the vineyards and fields. All right, go down to verse 22. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, appointed Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, to be over the people he had left in Judah. When all the army officers and their men heard that the king of Babylon had appointed Gedaliah a governor, they came to Gedaliah at Mizpah, Ishmael, son of Nathaniel, Johanan, son of Kara, Sariah, son of Tahumath, and all those other guys. Let's go, verse 24. Gedaliah took an oath to reassure them and their men. Don't be afraid of the Babylonian officials, he said. Settle down in the land and serve the king of Babylon, and it will go well for you. In the 7th month, however, Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, the son of Elishama, who was of royal blood, came with 10 men and assassinated Gedaliah and also the men of Judah and the Babylonians who were with him at Mizpah. At this, the people of the land, from the least to the greatest, together with the army officers, fled to Egypt for fear of the Babylonians. In the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the year evil Merodach became king of Babylon, he released Jehoiachin from prison on the 27th day of the 12th month. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat of honor higher than those of the other kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin put aside his prison clothes and for the rest of his life ate regularly at the king's table. Day by day, the king gave Jehoiachin a regular allowance as long as he lived. All right, so what we have is a softening towards the Jews. But here's the thing about the Jewish exile into Babylon. They weren't put into the ghettos or the prison camps and kept down. They brought back these educated people and these artists and all of these learned people for a reason, to assimilate them into their society so that their society would be bolstered by their knowledge. Okay?
Is this when Daniel and his friends?
Yes, yeah. That story takes place during the Babylonian exile. And of course, you know, he was an official in the court. So these were educated people. Now, I say that because when we get into Ezra and Nehemiah, you'll have the king of Babylon saying, you know what? Well, it sounds like he's being a really nice guy. I'm going to let some of y'all, if you want to, you can go back to Jerusalem and resettle it. It sounds like he's really being a great guy. What he's trying to do is get some people living there that he's over so that he can sort of control that land. But be that as it may, things were so good for the people in Babylon that only about 5,000 or 7,000 returned. A very, very, very small number of the Jews that were living in Babylon returned because they had it going good. Okay? So that's what we talk. We talk about a remnant. That was very much a remnant. And that's pretty much historically all we have. We're going to go in the First Chronicles, Second Chronicles. But that's pretty much historically what we have about the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Any questions on that before we go into Chronicles? Okay. Let's go to Chronicles. Now, when somebody studies the books of First and Second Chronicles, you're going to discover that it's very familiar. Half of it is word for word the material that we've already covered in the Bible up to this point. It copies material, some from Genesis, but mostly from 1st, 2nd Samuel and 1st, 2nd Kings. Now, we also discover that most of the material in 1st and 2nd Chronicles concerns Judah, the southern kingdom. Very, very little of these two books will refer to the northern kingdom of Israel. And the reason why is 1st and 2nd Chronicles were written for the returning exiles from Babylon. And they They were exiles from Judah. They were exiles from the southern kingdom. And so this was written for them, and so it gives them a view of their history. Now, let me tell you this. If you want to poke holes in the historical accuracy of the Bible, then Chronicles is the place to go, okay? The numbers, whether it be people or whatever, the numbers in Chronicles are always far higher than the other books that we've looked at, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Samuel, okay? Even though we find the same stories in those other books, the numbers are way higher in Chronicles. So, which books are right and which ones are wrong? Well, can you explain it? Because there are people that will come up to you and tell you the Bible's bogus because it contradicts itself. So how are you going to explain it? Huh?
Just a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, 1st and 2nd Chronicles want to show the power of God. Okay? And if you want to show the power of God, then you're going to have some amazingly high numbers. These were Jewish people. Stories were sacred to them. These people, especially the learned ones who knew 1st and 2nd Samuel, who knew 1st and 2nd Kings, they weren't saying, because it says back here in 2nd Kings that's not what they were doing. This is their culture. They understand. It's not our culture. And so we get bent out of shape and confused because stories are not sacred to us. We look at stories only as history. This is a theology book, not a history book. Okay? And so exaggerations can be made that point to the power of God. They weren't pulling the wool over anybody's eyes. It was a way of honoring God and telling the people, look what God can do, look what God can do. Jews like to exaggerate. In fact, there was a Jewish teacher, his name was Jesus. And he said, why are you worried about the speck in your eye when your neighbor has a log sticking out of his? Did anybody have a log sticking out of their eye? No. But he was a Jewish teacher, and he would exaggerate to make a godly point. And so as we go through this book, let's look at the point of the story. Okay? Remember back in Genesis, the opening chapters, you had two different stories of creation. In one, humans were the first thing made. In the other, humans were the last thing made. Okay, who's getting hung up on that? Well, non-Christians who are trying to poke holes in the Bible. They're sacred stories and they have a point. All right. So this book can be categorized into different parts. This is really not important, but I'm going to read it anyway because I got it right here. The first 10 chapters of 1 Chronicles, mostly genealogy list. It's all it is genealogy. It's list of everybody who begat everybody, okay? That's what it is. It includes the house of Saul, Saul's rejection by God, and it sets the stage for the rise of David. Chapters 11 through 29 of 1 Chronicle is the history of David's reign. We've had all of it before. The beginning of 2 Chronicles, chapters 1 through 9, is the history of the reign of King Solomon. We've had all that before. The remainder of 2 Chronicles, that is chapters 10 through 36, is the chronicles of the kings of Judah to the time of the Babylonian exile, which we just had. And it concludes with the call by Cyrus the Great to let the exiles go free. Cyrus the Great was the king of Persia. The prophets called him what? The Messiah. Oh, yes. But we'll get to that. a long time from now when we're in the prophets. A Messiah just means anointed, just means that God had his hand on him to do something. You don't have to be a Christian. You didn't have to be a Jew for God to have his hand on you for you to do something, okay? He's the God of creation. So we're not going to read the first 9 chapters. That's all that genealogy stuff. You are welcome to read it if you really want to. But we're going to go to chapter 10. We'll begin in verse 13. The genealogies end and the narrative begins with the story of Saul's death. The question trying to be answered is, how can a kingdom brought into being by God end up with a king like Saul running the kingdom into the ground? Well, and that story shows us that through David, that God's purposes are going to be carried out regardless. So God had a plan for these people. David seems to let that plan just get beat down. But no, God still has the plan, and he's going to do something, so in comes David. In 1 Chronicles 10, verses 1 through 12, it's word for word of what you would read in 1 Samuel 31, 1 through 13. Chronicles will add a little commentary, and so let's go to chapter 10, verse 13. Saul died because he was unfaithful to the Lord. He did not keep the word. See, this isn't in 1 Samuel. Saul died because he was unfaithful to the Lord. This is written for these remnant coming back to resettle this place and rebuild the temple. And they got to understand what faithfulness to the Lord is all about. So Saul died because he was unfaithful to the Lord. He did not keep the word of the Lord and even consulted a medium for guidance. He did not inquire of the Lord. So the Lord put him to death and turned the kingdom over to David, son of Jesse. So that is an example of the theological emphasis that Chronicle gives. The actual events of Saul's death in this book are not that important. It had nothing to do with the size of the opposing army. It had everything to do with Saul's unfaithfulness. So chapter 11, we'll begin with verse 1. All Israel came together at Hebron and said, "We're your own flesh and blood. In the past, even while Saul was king, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord your God said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler." Now, this is word for word 2 Samuel 5, 1 through 3. But what we don't have in Chronicles is anything from 2 Samuel 1 through 4. And 2 Samuel 1 through 4 is David's decade-long struggle to reunify the people. We don't have that here. All we have is Saul dies and then the people rallying around David. Yeah, he's the man. We don't have David's struggles, okay? And because that's not an important part for them. That they had that history. It was in those other books, but it wasn't an important part of their story coming back to Jerusalem. All right, verses 10 through 47 are the same word for word from 2 Samuel 23. No reason to go into that. So we'll go to chapter 12. We'll begin in verse 23. When we read the book of Judges, way back yonder when we read Judges, we learned that it told the story of settling the promised land, and it took generations to complete. When we read Joshua, it was the settling of the land, and it happened much more rapidly. So we have the stylistic differences here between 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles. Chapter 12 of 1 Chronicles tells the story of many warriors joining David. In 2 Samuel, David initially had a really hard time getting people to join his army. So we skip all that. Verse 23. These are the numbers of the men armed for battle who came to David at Hebron to turn Saul's kingdom over to him, as the Lord had said. The numbers, the numbers that we're giving here are nearly 400,000 men. But don't get hung up on those numbers. I'm not saying there weren't, but nowhere else do we get the idea that David mustered an army that large. But the point, that's what they want you to know, is the point was David's reign was ordained by God. I mean, it had to be because he had such a large army. The large army is there just to show that David was ordained by God to allow this to happen. He was pro-kingdom, okay? And he was pro-David. Go down to verse 38. All these were fighting men who volunteered to serve in the ranks. They came to Hebron fully determined to make David king over all Israel. All the rest of the Israelites were also of one mind to make David king. Well, we never quite got that. David was popular, but we never quite, in 2 Samuel, got the idea that all the people were for him. In fact, we clearly saw that there were some towns here and there that weren't, but David was very just towards them. Okay, but Chronicles has an emphasis for these returning exiles. They needed to know that God was for them. So chapter 13 is basically the retelling of 2 Samuel 6. That's the story of David's first attempt to bring the ark back to Jerusalem. The Ark of the Covenant, that is. Remember in that story, David doesn't get the ark all the way back. Do you remember why he didn't get the ark all the way back to Jerusalem? Well, let's just read it, okay? Let's go to verse 9, chapter 13. You'll remember it when you hear this, but we had this in 2 Samuel 6. When they came to the threshing floor of Kidon, Uzzah, reached out his hand to steady the ark because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah and he struck him down because he had put his hand on the ark. So he died before God. Then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah, and to this day that place is called Perez Uzzah. David was afraid of God that day and asked, "How can I ever bring the ark of God back to me?" He didn't take the ark back to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. The ark of God remained with the family of Obed-Edom in his house for 3 months, and the Lord blessed his household and everything he had. Y'all remember that story now? Yeah, I knew you would. Why was Uzzah struck down? We can gather that he mishandled the ark in some way. Now, that seems extreme to us, but what would the point be to these returning exiles? Well, these returning exiles are coming back with the duty of rebuilding the temple and all of the things that go in the temple and all of the religious practices. So they needed to know that there should be reverence when we handle things in the sanctuary of God. And for us as well, we should remember to be reverent with objects that we use, whether it's for communion or whatever it is when we worship. So David has two emotions towards God. He has anger and he has fear. And his anger was based on confusion. Why did God let this happen? A lot of times our anger is towards God because we're not sure why God allows certain things to happen. Our task, whether it's with God or another person, is when we're angry, is to work through that anger towards a resolution. Okay. Let's go to chapter 15. Chapter 15 and 16 tell the story of the ark finally returning to Jerusalem. We find this story in 2 Samuel chapter 6, but the big difference here is found in the great detail that the writer gives to the priests and Levites. Now, this should make sense because these ragtag bunch of exiles come back and they're going to be tasked with the duty of making sure that the worship is right and everything is orderly. So they're going to emphasize the priests and the Levites. 1 Chronicles 15, go to verse 11. Then David summoned Zadok and Abiathar, the priests, and Uriel, Asaiah, Joel, Shemaiah, Elel, Amminadab, the Levites. He said to them, "You are the heads of the Levitical families. You and your fellow Levites are to consecrate yourselves and bring up the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel, to the place I have prepared it. It was because you, the Levites, did not bring it up the first time that the Lord our God broke out against us." So we're told there, and we don't really get that before, but we kind of get the idea, oh, they didn't have the right officials there, okay? And so again, the emphasis is if we're going to do things right in the temple of the Lord, if we're going to do things right in our sanctuary, we have to have the right people there. Verse 14, or let's continue in 13. "We did not inquire of him about how to do it in the prescribed way. So the priests and the Levites consecrated themselves in order to bring up the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel. And the Levites carried the ark of God with poles on their shoulders," okay? They're carrying it a completely different way. This is the way it was depicted when they moved it around, whether it was in the wilderness or when they crossed the Jordan River coming into the promised land. This is the way they did. But how was it being transported before? On an oxen, okay? So it looks like it's being treated differently by officials that were trained to do this, and they're doing it the prescribed way. The Levites carried the ark of God with poles on their shoulders, as Moses had commanded in accordance with the word of the Lord. David told the leaders of the Levites to appoint their fellow Levites as musicians to make a joyful sound with musical instruments, lyre, harps, and cymbals. The story will go on in great detail about the role that the priests and the Levites play. Also, we see an emphasis there on music, and we'll have some more emphasis on music in this book. Sacred music was becoming a thing. Their worship was being redefined, redeveloped, because it was pretty watered down in Babylon. So purity of worship. We've got to keep worship pure. Now, at this church, we have two different worship styles. If we were to visit a dozen churches on any given Sunday, you'd find probably a lot of different. You'd probably find at least 7 different worship styles. You know, you got blending, the worship style is not that important. Different cultures, you go to Mexico, you go to Africa, you go to China, you're going to have different worship styles. What's important is worship purity, and that means reverence. What about the people that are leading worship? Who do we have leading worship? What are their lives like? And so this is what's being emphasized here in Chronicles. Go down to chapter 15, verse 25. "So David and the elders of Israel and the commanders of units of 1,000 went to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord from the house of Obed-Edom with rejoicing, because God had helped the Levites who were carrying the ark of the covenant of the Lord. 7 bulls and 7 rams were sacrificed. Now David was clothed in a robe of fine linen, as were all the Levites who were carrying the ark, as were the musicians." We got musicians, that's important now. "And Kenaiah, who was in charge of the singing of the choirs." It's important now. David also wore a linen ephod, that's a priestly dress, clothing. "So all Israel brought up the ark of the covenant of the Lord with shouts, with the sounding of ram's horns, trumpets, cymbals, and the playing of lyres and harps. As the ark of the covenant of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window, and when she saw King David dancing and celebrating, she despised him in her heart." That's pretty much the same as 2 Samuel 6, except David's not leaping this time, but he's dancing and celebrating, which the Jews do when they worship, okay? Chapter 16 will go into more detail about the Levites. Go to chapter 16, verse 4. It says, "He appointed some of the Levites to minister before the ark of the Lord, to extol, thank, and praise the Lord, the God of Israel. So we see their role becoming reestablished. Verse 7. That day, David first appointed Asaph. That's an important name, but let's read this passage and we'll talk about him. That day, David first appointed Asaph and his associates to give praise to the Lord in this manner. Give praise to the Lord, proclaim his name, make known among the nations what he has done. Sing to him, sing praises to him, tell of his wonderful acts. Glory is his holy name. Let the hearts of those who seek the Lord rejoice. Look to the Lord in his strength, seek his face always. Well, that goes on, and these verses are from various psalms, okay? Rightly so. Because we have Asaph, who is given more prominent role here in Chronicles than we've had before. There are 12 psalms, 12 of the psalms. David did not write all the psalms. At least 12 were written by Asaph. And in fact, the musicians in the temple, once it was completed, were called Asaphites. Asaphites, okay? There's a little trivia you can lay down on your friends next time. It gets kind of boring. Anyway, so he's emphasized in Chronicles, so that tells us that there's a growing interest in sacred music. And they had it before, but the role is growing. Chapter 17 is word for word 2 Samuel 7. That's David's desire to build a temple. We don't need to read it again. Chapters 18 through 20 are various stories of David's victories. All of these can be found almost word for word in 2 Samuel. The order of events with the victories and the building of the temple are a little different, but otherwise it's the same material. Chapter 21. So we haven't been comparing where we're at, but let's look at, I'm going to go back, you don't have to, I'm going to go to 2 Samuel 24, okay? 2 Samuel 24 verse 1 says, Again the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, Go take a census of Israel and Judah, unified. So the king said to Joab and the army commanders with them, Go throughout the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba and enroll the fighting men so that I know how many there are. Well, let's go to 1 Chronicles 21, verse 1. Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to take a census. Well, where did this guy Satan come from? We haven't had him before. So David said to Joab and the commanders of the troops, Go and count the Israelites from Beersheba to Dan, then report back to me so I may know how many there are. Now back in 2 Samuel 24, the anger of the Lord incited David to do this. And now, Satan. What's the deal? Which one's correct? Well, why do we have Satan here? Well, at this point, their understanding of good and evil in their theology, right now, Satan is not yet the chief of evil who opposes God. That's not how they're thinking of Satan at this time. At this time, Satan was sort of this person who went to and fro reporting to God. And he would try to say, well, look, have you read Job? Okay? Job's hanging out with God, and he's saying, you know what? I don't know about this guy Job. And God says, no, he's a great guy. And Satan says, no, I don't think so. So Satan was understood as an angel who furthers the will of God. He travels back and forth to earth, sort of testing people for God. Now, Satan is very real, and he didn't just end up being bad. When you read the Bible in its entirety, the personification of evil is not always called Satan. Sometimes it has other names, Beelzebub and these other names. So at this point, that character they don't fully understand. And at this point, that character really isn't called Satan. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, there is an evolution. Look, if we're reading stories that got it right, then we'd all be Jews. Okay? But they didn't get it right, so we're all Christians. Amen? All right. So don't get hung up on that. So there are some differences in the story here. Let's go to 2 Samuel verse 24:9. I'll read it. 2 Samuel 24:9. Joab reported the number of the fighting men to the king. In Israel, there were 800,000 able-bodied men who could handle a sword, and in Judah, 500,000. David was conscience-stricken after he had counted the fighting men, and he said to the Lord, I've sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, Lord, I beg you to take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing. See, he was prideful and he knew it. 1 Chronicles 21, verse 4. The king's word, however, overruled Joab. So Joab left and went throughout Israel, came back to Jerusalem. Joab reported the number of fighting men to David. In all Israel, there were 1,100,000 men who could handle a sword, including 470,000 in Judah. One of those books is wrong. No, one of those books has an emphasis different than the other. But Joab did not include Levi and Benjamin in the numbering because the king's command was repulsive to him. This command was also evil in the sight of God, so he punished Israel. Then David said to God, I have sinned greatly by doing this. Now I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing. I think by the time that Chronicles was written, they had a better understanding that, evil does push us. It's not God, it's evil that pushes us to do things, okay? So their idea of Satan, of evil, was growing. Don't get hung up on the numbers. Just don't do it. The numbers are exaggerated to show the great pride of David. David was all puffed up. Look what I got. It was just showing that this guy had some faults. All right, we do the same thing. I'm so blessed because I got a new car. Oh, that's kind of prideful, is it not? It is. All right. Oh, look at the time. Well, can we agree that we're finished chapter 21 and we'll start chapter 22 next time? Okay? Questions?
In chapter 16, verse 1, it says they offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. Any idea what the peace offerings might have been?
Pretty much what they were offering burnt offerings for was to be at peace.
That was not
Yeah.
two different things, but
Right.
and they were.
Yeah. I mean, that's the whole law system. They wanted to be at peace with God. Jesus brings us peace with God. He is a fulfillment of the offerings. Excellent. Excellent. All right. Well, we will pick up, where did I say? Chapter 22. Great. Let's pray. Gracious God, we thank you for the power of these stories that we have read tonight. Our faithfulness to you is a must. And sometimes the things of the world do make us prideful and do pull us away from you. Help us, dear God, to focus on you. And as we learn, as we heard this morning, and we're reminded by the scriptures of Jesus, we should seek you before all things. So thank you, God, for these stories. Thank you for our church. Thank you for the people that have led us thus far so. Be with us now as we travel our separate ways. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. Thanks, folks.